on time. We have a lot of amazing speakers and information to cover. Thank you to those who sent questions in ahead of time. We actually saw some robust information sharing and discussions via email. We're going to figure out some ways that people can continue to share resources, but tonight we're going to focus on some of the stories and some of the organizations that are working on this. Quick logistics, I'll be monitoring the chat in the Q&A session throughout the program, and then Kaveh, our moderator, will have the opportunity to address those as you wish. You're certainly free to reach out to individual panelists if you know them personally or specific questions, and we'll all do our best to answer that. You're also invited to join us after this program immediately in a Zoom breakout room, and we'll put the link in the chat several times to make sure everybody has that link to join us afterwards. So without further ado, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Joellen Gray, who is in Connecticut and one of the leaders of the YANA New England chapter who put this whole program together. So Joellen, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. Since the Taliban regained control of Afghanistan in August of 2021, just 6 months ago, the US evacuated close to 75,000 Afghans to the United States. More Afghan refugees remain in other countries, waiting for the green light to come and resettle in the US. The last time the US saw a refugee resettlement program of this scale was Vietnam, when 130,000 refugees were relocated over the course of 1 full year. The abrupt arrival and scale of this effort, on the heels of a systematic dismantling of our refugee resettlement infrastructure and amid a national housing crunch, has left the administration and nonprofit agencies scrambling to find homes, jobs, education, food, and healthcare. Recognizing the often close relationship between the US military and their Afghan interpreters, the Biden administration took an unprecedented step by creating a program for veterans with ties to Afghans to work in tandem with resettlement agencies to bring refugees to their cities and to serve as a support network. In fact, a Yale alum, Dave Goich, class of '92, profiles just such a friendship in the CBS television series, United States of Al, a program that is written by 5 Afghans and 7 military veterans. We welcome Afghan refugees to the United States, recognizing that they have lived through truly traumatic conditions. First, life in a war-torn country, an abrupt departure, and the loss of community. And now, unfamiliar language, culture, and future. Yet many face the uncertainty of their life in the United States with hope. Tonight's webinar will provide insight into the challenges faced by Afghan refugees and those who seek to help them resettle in the United States. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Kaveh Kushnut, I hope I've said that correctly, Associate Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies at the Yale School of Public Health, and a member of the Executive Committee at the Yale Council on Middle East Studies. Kaveh, thank you. Would you please begin this evening's discussion by introducing the panelists and also telling us about your work at Yale?
Sure. Thank you so much, Joellen. It's a pleasure to be with you all. I'd like to begin by thanking our panelists for joining us. Dr. Richard Malika, a graduate of Yale Divinity School and former resident in the Department of Psychiatry at Yale Medical School, and now the head of the Harvard Program in Refugee Trauma. Through his research, clinical work, and training program, he's recognized as a leader in the treatment and rehabilitation of traumatized people and their communities around the world. Next, we have Chris George, the Executive Director of IRIS, the very well-respected Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services in New Haven. And we also have 3 Afghan natives, Shabana Basij Rasikh, the founder and president of SOLA, School of Leadership in Afghanistan, Husna Samadi, an ambassador with IRIS, and Khalil Arab, a former US interpreter now working with the US military to help Afghan refugees transition to live in America. You're all remarkable people with a unique perspective to share, and I will ask you to tell us more about yourself and your nonprofit organization as the evening goes on. And Joellen, to respond to your question and the work that I do at Yale, as you mentioned, my background is in public health. I'm an associate professor at Yale School of Public Health, and I have a particular interest in health issues of people impacted by humanitarian crisis. I myself was born in Iran and went through the revolution and the Iran-Iraq war. And as a teenager, I had to leave the country myself. And I came to the United States, and I had the privilege of being able to come to Yale School of Public Health for my master's and PhD, and now I've become a faculty member. So I'd like to start by asking Richard. I actually had a couple of questions for Richard, but I know he has a slide deck to share with us. So I'll let you, Richard, to share your slides, and then we'll have a couple of questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Fanny, you could hold back on this for a minute. Just my colleague Fanny is going to share the screen. Thank you so much. I want to thank you all. It's a great honor to be here. I'm a graduate of the Department of Psychiatry in Yale Divinity School, and my work with refugees began in December 1981. We started the first clinic for refugees in the United States. There was another one in Oregon, and we were dealing with the crisis with the Vietnam War. You know, thousands of Indo-Chinese were flooding into America, and at that time, we knew nothing about the Khmer Rouge. We knew nothing about the human rights. We couldn't make a diagnosis, and it goes on and on. We were really at a very low level of medical intervention. So, and my teachers at Yale, at the Divinity School, and in Department of Psychiatry, I owe this to my mentors there, particularly Fritz Redlich, who was the first American psychiatrist to be dean of medical school. Our program at Harvard over the past 40 years was based on Yale, our work at Yale. So, you know, I pay homage to my alma mater, you know, for providing me with the tools I needed with my team, my Indo-Chinese psychiatry team. My team began with people from Indochina, from Vietnam, Hmong people of Laos, and Cambodian people. And we started the first clinic, and we kind of invented this field, really. So I'm honored to be here with you all. There's a kind of deja vu here, going back to 1981 when the refugees were flooding in from Indochina. And in our psychiatry service, not a single refugee was seen in psychiatry. Thousands were coming to the health center, and not one was psychiatry. And we moved into the primary healthcare setting a half day a week as an experiment to provide the most to the least, the people who had the least. So I want to thank my Afghan colleagues and experts, and I'm honored to be here with you. It's an honor for me. So I'm going to try to take it to another level and talk about the trauma story, which I introduced in 1988. Fanny, can you start sharing the screen now, please? Thank you. This is my colleague, Fanny Kai, who's one of my close colleagues at Harvard. Yeah, so let's go to the next slide. Go to the next one. So we know that violence causes losing the world. Let me talk about losing the world for 1 minute here. Losing the world means that everything you believe in, your culture, your family, everything you've been taught is turned upside down. You know, when we were working in Bosnia, you know, who would ever believe that troops would come in and rape every woman in the village in order to destroy the community? This caused people to lose the world. What they believed in was totally turned upside down. How's this possible? And I'm sure Afghan colleagues will talk about this. Next slide. And what I discovered, and this was rarely discussed in our field, was the major instrument of violence is humiliation. People use the tools of humiliation to create the state of humiliation, to annihilate the individual, the family, the culture, and even the society. Humiliation is a big one. And my African-American colleagues years ago said, this is what we got dealing with the police, etc. They understood humiliation and its role as a form of cultural annihilation. Humiliation is used to create the state of humiliation, to bring you so low, you don't even feel worthy in front of your God. Then you lose your home. You're displaced. Next slide. Then your family role, you may have a father who's murdered, a child who's murdered. The mother often has to take on tremendous responsibilities in being a provider, caretaker, therapist, taking care of the family, the very important role of the women in taking care of the family. And all of this inside ourselves, inside every human being, leads to what we call the trauma story. Now, before I go to the next slide, wait a minute, Fanny, is that the trauma story isn't something negative. It's our own personal narrative about what we've experienced and what we share and sometimes don't share because we don't know if people are going to listen. The next slide. Now, this is very important to understand. Traumatic life experiences are universal. Nobody goes through life without having a tragedy in life. Nobody. Your mother dies. Son is killed in a car accident. It goes on and on. Then we have the experiences of people live through mass violence and torture. In our clinic, we've cared for over 10,000 survivors of torture from many different countries over the past 40 years. And the tragedy is universal. It's inescapable, but we have to acknowledge that a profound pain and fear enters us when we realize that one human being has intentionally hurt another. This is a terrible story for us as human beings. When one human being intentionally hurts another human being, it leads to a very traumatic situation for all of us. It's different than a disaster, accident, etc. Human violence on human violence is terrible for all of us. But I want to say here that we share as human beings a solidarity with all human beings. And this partly is due to our mirror neurons. We have 100,000 mirror neurons in each of us that are ancestral experiences that we all share with each other, including the animal kingdom. The next slide, please. So I want to talk briefly about the trauma story, how to understand it. You're saying, well, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nurse. Well, this is for anybody, this is for the general public, really. A trauma story is not a buried treasure. You don't go looking for gold, you don't have a shovel and go, I'm going to dig up the trauma story. You have to be very sensitive and develop a trusting relationship and listen deeply to what people want to share with you, which my colleagues are going to do today, my Afghan colleagues, And so there are 4 elements of the trauma story. This came out of our oral history work with Cambodian women. We spent 10 years interviewing Cambodian women that weren't patients, a princess, a farmer, a dancer, etc. And we learned from them that there's a kind of phenomenology to the trauma story. And the trauma story has 4 elements to it. And we use this in our clinical work and listening to people and storytelling, oral history, etc. The facts. What happened? So our colleagues are going to tell you what happened, the facts. Now, the facts associated with high emotion is what I call the toxic trauma story. And this is what we see on the news every day. If it bleeds, it leads. This is not good storytelling. Toxic trauma makes people sick. It makes them worse. Brutal facts associated with high emotion is not good. We need deeper understanding of the story. So when we look at the next thing, this was taught to me by my colleague at Radcliffe, Schlesinger Library, Pat King. Everyone tells the story. Everyone you're going to listen to tells the story from their own cultural meaning of trauma. I'm Italian American. When I tell my story, it's an Italian story, American story. I can't tell a Vietnamese story. I've listened to hundreds of Vietnamese patients, but every patient, every citizen tells their story out of their own cultural meaning. And we listen deeply. Wow, the things we learn about these cultures, the poetry, the art. I had an Iraqi general who didn't allow his troops, Kava will know this, he wouldn't allow the young people to be killed in the Iran-Iraq war. He forbid them to go onto the field. Saddam Hussein heard about this. He brought him in and he personally tortured my patient, a general. Tortured him personally because he wouldn't allow the young people to be killed. When he came to me in the clinic, he said, Dr. Malika, I'm so depressed, I can't function. Can you help me? And I said, sure, let's try to work together. He goes, I need you to read with me the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, Kava, you know the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? He goes, that's my story. I couldn't remember the Epic of Gilgamesh. So every week for 1 year, we read the Epic of Gilgamesh together. And at the end, he said, I'm cured. Thank you for listening to my story. I said, General, I said, it was an honor to work with you, to know you, to learn about the Gilgamesh Epic and to your culture, your society. Thank you so much. This is the cultural meaning of trauma. Revelations. This is from Divinity School to Thomas Merton, looking behind the curtain. You know, when our world is ripped apart, all of a sudden we see things we thought were good are bad. Like in Cambodia, they wouldn't allow the young girls to read and write because they might write to a boyfriend. So they wouldn't educate the girls. After the Khmer Rouge, the women said, this is crazy. You're not going to let me read and write? I accepted this, but I'm coming to America. I want to get my master's degree. I'm serious. Women who were not allowed to read and write come to America and they go on and get their master's degree. Okay, this is revelation. Every trauma survivor has wisdom, knowledge, insight, and it's a great honor for me to have worked with them all these years. They have taught me so much about how to be a dignified human being. They're my teachers. I tell them, all the patients, I said, I'm your student. You're my teacher. Teach me about yourself and your culture. And then finally, there's this beautiful storyteller relationship. The storyteller has empathy. The listener has empathy. And we say that therapy, but it's more than therapy, that it's a shared empathic partnership between two people creating a new worldview. You notice no medical terms there. Two people in a community in a shared empathic partnership creating a new worldview, like I did with the general. The general and I co-constructed a new life of dignity for him and for myself. Beautiful, isn't it? The relationship between the listener and the storyteller is a beautiful relationship. It's special. So let me go on, and I still got a few more minutes left, and then we're going to stop. Next one. This is one of my favorite stories. You know, in Italy, everyone reads Primo Levi. He, in Italian, is called Se questo nomo. What does it mean to be a person? Here it's called Survival in Auschwitz. And this is what I'm getting at. He's in the concentration camp. He's writing this beautiful story about his life in the concentration camp. It's very moving, very beautiful. I recommend everyone read it. And he has this dream, and he says, all of the prisoners have this dream. Let me read this dream to you. It's so moving. I love this dream. I knew Primo Levi. I met him. He's an amazing person. This is his dream. While a prisoner in the concentration camp, maybe the Afghans can, my Afghan colleagues can relate, talk about this, is an intense pleasure, physical, inexpressible to be at home among friendly people and have so many things to recount. Now he's living this, dreaming about this in the concentration camp, but I cannot help noticing that my listeners do not follow me. In fact, they are completely indifferent. They speak confusedly of other things among themselves as if I was not there. My sister looks at me, gets up and goes away without a word. This really moves me. I always cry when a desolating grief is now born in me. Not listening, turning away when he's trying to tell the story of the concentration camp. This is painful to people. It hurts. It hurts to not listen. Is that, it does, what a beautiful, a desolating grief is now born into me when a sister turns away. Now, we all know as human beings that sometimes our families, our spouses, our loved ones turn away. Too painful for them, right? Sometimes they turn away. They say, I can't handle this, Often in the community, people who are not Afghani or Vietnamese or whatever, they turn away. They don't want to hear. Too painful for them. They don't listen. This is really what hurts people, not listening. So I'm going to just go through 2 more slides and I'll be done. Next slide. So we developed this H5 model. This is a phenomenological model from the ground up. And this model is based on many decades of experience listening to survivors of torture, mass violence, gender-based violence, etc. And so at the heart of the model is the trauma story, but then we know there are other experiences that people have that need to be dealt with. Human rights, being a refugee, already you're suffering human rights violation. And do you know that it's rare for the UN in the refugee camps to ask people what happened to them? Human rights wise, they don't take records of this. I had a big fight in Lebanon about this in the Syrian refugee camps. How come you're not asking people what happened to them? Maybe you could take this to the court, to the Hague, Humiliation we already discussed. Self-healing, when violence occurs, the human being, Afghani, Laotian, Italian, whatever, healing immediately begins at the physical, mental, and spiritual level, psychological level. Healing begins. Every human being tries to heal themselves. It's amazing. Self-healing is something we need to support in every human being who's been violated. Health promotion. Do you know that the risk for diabetes, heart disease, stroke, etc., is much, much, much higher in people who've been violated? The Cambodians went through the Khmer Rouge. They had a genocide. Millions of people were killed. They came to the United States. 25 years later, they have diabetes, heart disease, stroke, terrible problems because the seed of disease has been planted in the body of the survivor. So we have to, we must have health promotion programs for survivors, including children. That's a whole nother subject, including children and adolescents. Because 25, 30 years, Kava knows this, right? Public health. I mean, 25, 30, we know the ACE study, we know all these things, 25, 30 years, they're going to be hit hard. In my clinic, 25 years later, became a diabetes clinic. Everybody had diabetes. And I had to teach them how to not get diabetes, how to prevent diabetes through diet, exercise, etc. This is a big one, habitat and housing. The word habitat in Latin is not just a shelter. It's the environment you live in. The frog lives in the pond. The pond lives in the frog. A healthy frog creates a healthy pond. A healthy pond creates a healthy frog. This is more than housing. And all my patients, I talk to them, I say, what is a home? They all say the same thing. And even the few Afghan people I've met and the Iraqis will say, they say, home is a place where in the kitchen, you smell the food of your grandmother. Now, all Italians, we know this. No basil, no rosemary, no garlic, no home. And the Afghan people are the same way. Home is where in your kitchen you smell the food of your grandmother, right? My colleagues, they know what I'm talking about. In my home, my boys were raised by my mother from Italy, and they go, Dad, where's the garlic smell? There's no garlic smell here. There's no home. What's the problem here? They come from college, they go, where's the smell? So habitat is very important because it's all about cultural meaning and the meaning of home. Okay. And then finally, I just want to give you a little lesson here. The next slide, 2 more slides will end. I think I'm okay, right? Yeah, okay, good. So Fanny, do we have the one on resiliency? Let's see if we have the slide on resiliency. Is it the next one after this one here? Yeah, okay, go back to the other slide. Okay. So you're not clinicians, most of you. And so you have to begin with habitat, the big term habitat, not housing, not just housing. You have to think about health promotion. You have to promote self-healing and resiliency, we'll talk about in a minute. You want to listen to the trauma story when people are ready to tell it. When you have a trusting relationship with people, a friendly relationship, be ready to listen. Don't turn away. But this comes, later, people, in my experience, people who are coming in a crisis will eventually tell you the story. They want to tell you the story. My colleagues can talk about this, but it may not be the first thing they talk about. Or it may be, depending on them personally, And then, we talk about human rights violations, which are common. And humiliation is the hardest thing to talk about. Humiliation is deep. It's inside of people. It's really, really hard to talk about humiliation. And I don't recommend it, in the sense that I think it's something that some of my patients took 30 years. I've seen some of my patients 35, 40 years, took 30 years before they would talk about humiliation because of the shame, the guilt, it's a cultural as well. It's a very sensitive area. So I know you guys are going to be talking about habitat and health promotion, self-healing, and the other, and be ready to listen. Be ready to listen. Be ready to, as friend, neighbor, colleagues, be ready to listen. Be ready to listen, because people will share their stories with you, and it's very important to listen to people's stories. And then finally, the last slide is. we know from all of our research, the major social instruments of healing are social connectedness, the family. When I was asked to talk about the bases, I said, people need to be connected to their family. Even in Afghanistan, they got to be able to call up on WhatsApp, check in with their mom and dad. You know, you can't have people here who are disconnected. People need connection. The family is key. The friends, the spouse, the children. Then we also know that altruism, which is normal in survivors, work and school for children, and spirituality are very important resiliency factors. People who help others, who work, who go to school, who are spiritual, are more resilient and have a better mental health situation. So I think that pretty well does it. Fanny is going to post for people the H5 model. So if anyone wants to go to the website, they can find it. So thank you very much. Next slide. Now, one of the single things that the research has shown is that the more hope you have, the more resilient you are to against depression and PTSD and things like that. In other words, hope seems to be something that protects people against serious mental health problems, as well as the other things. There's a lot of research on this now. How you generate hope, I'll let my colleagues talk about that, because hope, yeah, I had a patient, her whole family was murdered. She woke up on a pile of dead bodies, and it took a long time for her to get past that humiliation, that loss, and develop hope, you know. But we got there because we're really, really talking about all this work, the restoration of people to human dignity. That's the bottom line, right? Whether we're clinicians or in the community, we're restoring people to human dignity. I talk a lot about this in my book, and I think here's our website if anyone's interested. I'm not trying to sell anything or anything, and you can find there's thousands of pages free on our website. You know, thank you very much.
Richard, thank you so much. I could really tell you have decades of clinical and research experience, and we're going to have to invite you back for a lengthier conversation with you. So thank you so much. I'm going to now switch to our Afghan colleagues, Hasna, Khalil, and Shabana. Each of you came to United States under different circumstances. I would appreciate if you can each tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to United States. So maybe I can start with Hasna.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. And it's a big honor to be with you all. And Shabana Jan, first, when I was learning English, I started with TikTok videos of you. So that's how I got familiar, like at the beginning, with your name and what a wonderful job you're doing. My name is Hosna Samadi. I'm originally from Afghanistan, and I started school under the regime of the Taliban in the late 90s, which was a secret homeschool. I mean by secret homeschool, we were going to teachers' home to learn reading and writing and get knowledge. But we had to keep that secret because our family and our teachers' life was in danger. For the first time, when I went to a real school, it was 2002, which was a big dream come true for Afghan girls after 5 years banned from school, work, and that was a big opportunity for them. I finished high school in Afghanistan. I came to United States in 2016 with my family through my husband's special immigration visa. He worked with United States Agency for International Development for more than 7 years, and due to his job with US projects, we were facing threats from insurgents. When we came to United States, we were resettled by IRIS in New Haven, Resettlement Agency. Now I am taking my last semester of associate degree at Gateway Community College. Aside from that, I am volunteering on the IRIS Culture Companions early team, where we introduce IRIS clients to volunteers who are willing to befriend with refugees. And I work as an interpreter and translator for Century Kitchen. I am the co-founder of CREW, the Collective for Refugee and Immigrant Women's Wellbeing Project, which is a pilot project for Afghan women in New Haven. And it's a project we are partnering with YAL PARCH program. So yeah, that was a brief summary.
Thank you so much, Hasna.
Thank you.
Khalil, can you tell us a little bit about your background and your journey coming to the United States?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm honored to be here as well. Thank you, everyone, for your time being here today. I was born and raised in Herat, Afghanistan, west of Afghanistan. And I started working for the U.S. Coalition Forces back in 2004 as a plumber. And in a span of a year, I learned English, and I was offered to work as an interpreter. And I took that chance. It's probably 18 or 19 at that time. I was 17 when I started. And I realized this is my only chance to contribute into this peace process that we saw was actually taking place. And as naive as I was, I thought, well, this will be substantial and we can probably make some impact, and why not be part of the history? So fast forward 2010, I received a threatened letter from the Taliban, and I had to flee the country. And I found myself moving to Europe, where I lived for almost 10 years. There, I studied. I got 2 bachelor's degree and master's degree, and I was in the course of my PhD when my special immigrant visa, or SIV, was approved in December of 2019, and I moved to the United States. While in Europe, while studying, I also had a chance to volunteer with a number of non-governmental organizations working with refugees and immigrants, including in Poland, Germany, and also a brief period worked as an interpreter, translator, and cultural mediator with European Asylum Service Office, or EASO, in Greece, where I have been able to listen to a lot of the stories that were heartbreaking. And Professor, I can relate to all these traumatic stories where we were listening to people coming through the experiences that I cannot even imagine how a human being can endure. And ever since coming to the United States in 2019, I volunteered with this great organization called Combined Arms, which is predominantly supporting veterans to transition from military to civilian life. However, they have this program called SIV and Allies, Special Immigrant Visa and Allies. They're supporting all the SIV recipients, not just Afghans, but also Iraqis who arrived here in the United States through the SIV program. And starting November of last year, I was offered to manage that program, and we are helping Afghans at the moment. So I wanted to show you a few slides, but I'm not going to, and I will probably just go through some of the details, what we do. But I'll also allow our colleague Shabana to also go through her background and introduce herself, maybe.
All right, thank you, Khalid. We will come back to you with questions. Shabana, it would be wonderful to hear from you, your story and your journey into the United States.
Sounds great. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's it's an honor to be speaking with you all today and to listen to all these stories shared so far. Hosnajan, thank you also for sharing that anecdote. That was really wonderful and heartwarming. I like Hosna, I was born and raised in Kabul city and lived through the first Taliban regime when education was banned for girls, and also attended a secret underground school for girls where I received my primary education, and attended a public school for the first time in 2002 after the fall of Taliban regime. Then I came to the US in 2005 as a high school exchange student. It was actually a US State Department funded program to bring students from Muslim world, places like Afghanistan and other Muslim countries, to the United States for a 1 year of high school exchange program. And I ended up living with a wonderful host family in Wisconsin for a year. Attended a public school there, and as a young Afghan woman coming to the United States at age 15, it was quite a profound experience for me, especially when I experienced for the first time what it was like for girls in a society to not have to live with a daily pressure of the possibility of a threat to losing access to their education. You see, in Afghanistan, girls who do receive education, they already feel special or are reminded to be extra grateful that they have this opportunity because it's not afforded to all girls in Afghanistan. But to come to the US and where not a single girl had to even wonder about what it would be like to have their opportunity to receive an education taken away from them. That was quite an experience for me. I knew even then at a young age that when Afghanistan gets to a place where Afghan girls gets to take their education for granted, the way American girls do, that we will have received or achieved the kind of development as an Afghan society that cannot be reversed ever. And I wanted to work towards that. I continued on with my undergraduate education, this time at a small liberal arts college in Vermont, at Middlebury College, in 2007. And it was the same year when the UN published a report that indicated that only 6% at that time, 6% of Afghan women have an undergraduate degree or a bachelor's degree. And I was about to receive that degree from one of the most prestigious liberal arts institutions here in the United States, and was really overwhelmed by that experience. I felt incredibly privileged and lucky, but also quite guilty that I had that access and no one else did. And so by the end of my freshman year, I co-founded the School of Leadership Afghanistan, which is a US-based nonprofit organization, but also in Afghanistan, the first and only all-girls boarding school right now. In the beginning, the purpose was to bring young Afghan students to the United States through scholarship opportunities. But then in 2011, when the US government announced a timeline for withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan, things were changing dramatically on the ground, and we didn't want the organization to contribute to a brain drain. So decided to bring quality education to students in Afghanistan, and that's how SOLA became a boarding school. And in that process, realized that SOLA became the first and unfortunately the only all-girls boarding school in the country. To date, we have roughly 100 students representing 28 of the 34 provinces from Afghanistan. We have students in grade 6 through 12th, and in mid-August of 2021, we relocated the entire school community, our students, our faculty, staff, and family members of our faculty and staff to the nation of Rwanda. And upon 4 days after arrival in late August, we resumed classes, and currently our students are there continuing with their studies, and our hope is to continue to do more of that. So my journey coming to the US wasn't that of a refugee, but of an international student. And, you know, I listened to Dr. Richard Malika also talk about that experience. And interestingly, you know, living in Afghanistan, every single person knows at least someone in the family who's been forced out of Afghanistan because of circumstances and so on. And we also then absorb how refugees are treated outside of Afghanistan. So I remember from the very young age, my family telling me that I should do everything I can not to assume that identity of that of a refugee. And I saw the difference too of how I was treated as an international student, as a guest in the United States versus a refugee who lived here. Very different experiences. And I'm sure we will talk about this a bit more, but that's my story of coming to the US. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I hope one of my colleagues can put the link to your organization called School of Leadership Afghanistan. So if people are interested in learning more about that. Thank you so much for sharing that, Shabana. Now I'd like to switch to my colleague, Chris George, the Executive Director of IRIS that we've heard about already. Chris, if you can tell us a little bit about the work of IRIS and how you're managing to resettle Afghans in New Haven.
Thanks, Kaveh. It's privilege. It's also very humbling to be on this panel in the presence of so much accomplishment and courage. My path here was really one of privilege. Doors just swung open for me as a white American male. I did a stint as a plumber. Khalil, you and I have something in common, and we might want to share plumbing stories at some point. But in 1982, I was working as a plumber between overseas jobs. It took the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers, to see the great advantages of having Arabic and plumbing skills. And they sent me to South Lebanon to do some housing reconstruction, including repairing sewage lines in the refugee camps in South Lebanon. But I, for the past 17 years, have been the director of a refugee resettlement agency called IRIS. We're Connecticut's largest refugee resettlement agency. And over the summer, we put together our plans and shared them with the State Department. We would resettle maybe about 400 refugees over the course of 12 months. Fiscal year 2022, that would begin October 1. But then, as you know, things fell apart in Afghanistan. 75,000 Afghan evacuees were brought to the United States through the humanitarian parole program. The State Department suddenly had 75,000 people they needed to resettle in the United States. Fortunately, the Department of Defense opened up their military bases and provided housing, and I don't always feel gratitude for the Department of Defense, but I have to say they did a superb job of welcoming these Afghan allies. Khalil, I don't know if you visited any of the bases, but I visited Fort Dix in New Jersey. And, you know, in a military way, they really rolled out the red carpet for Afghans. They constructed all kinds of facilities. It was such an outpouring of generosity and hospitality on that base. Believe it or not, some Afghans who were later resettled with resettlement agencies sent emails back to the military at Fort Dix saying, we wish we were back there. We're just not getting the services that you guys gave us at Fort Dix. So it's been a challenge for refugee resettlement agencies. In September, the Department of State turned to the refugee resettlement organizations. There are 9 large national groups. Underneath them, there are about 200 nonprofits like ours, IRIS, in Connecticut. And the Department of State said to them, look, we've got 75,000 Afghans here in the United States. They have to be resettled as soon as possible. They can't stay on these military bases that long. How many can you resettle? The initial response from the refugee resettlement organizations was 40,000. That's quite a gap of 35,000. So we scrambled, everyone else scrambled, and we have now resettled just about all of them. There are fewer than 1,000 Afghans left at Fort Dix, and over the next few days, they will be resettled by refugee resettlement agencies, and a few hundred by a new initiative called Sponsor Circles, which is an emergency response to the crisis, whereby groups of just 5 people can come together, get a little bit of training. We're offering the training, IRIS is, and then they can welcome a family in their neighborhood. It is a abbreviated, streamlined version of what we call community-based resettlement in Connecticut, or community co-sponsorship, a model that is as old as the hills. And in fact, Dr. Malika made reference to the refugees who came in 1980 from Southeast Asia. More than 100,000 were resettled in 1 year, largely by community groups. A very informal, volunteer-heavy, not much funding way of welcoming refugees. Well, we took that model, we updated it, we developed a manual, a training program, an application, and back in 2015, 2016, when there was the Syrian refugee crisis, more than 50 community groups in Connecticut stepped forward and said, we want to welcome refugees. We want to do more than just write checks and donate winter coats. We want to be trained on how to welcome newcomers, and we will welcome them in our community. And, you know, the training is really nothing very special, because most people over 50 years of age, as most of our volunteers are, they have experience finding apartments. They have experience setting up apartments. They have experience arranging medical appointments for people. They have experience enrolling kids in school. They have experience teaching people English. They have experience tutoring kids in school, helping people with their homework, helping people find jobs, arguing with utility companies. They've got that experience. It's just a matter of a bit of training on top of that, applying it to a new family from another country, and they do a spectacular job. At IRIS, we have a policy, and I think it's the same across the country with refugee resettlement agencies. Dr. Malika, you made reference to this. We do not ask refugees to tell their stories. We don't. Our policy is, if they bring it up, fine, but we don't probe, we don't ask. Well, you know, over the past 4 months, as we've been resettling more Afghans in 4 months than we have ever resettled, even in a 12-year period, we don't have time to listen to stories. But the beauty of the community-based model, the beauty of a group of volunteers coming together and resettling refugees, is that they are providing services that a refugee agency provides, and they are also becoming their friends. And you know, I think one of the most important things that was said to me in 2005 when I started my job as director of a refugee resettlement agency was, refugees need friends as much as they need a case manager. A friend who can sit down and take the time over a cup of sweet tea and talk about their stories and listen to them. My case managers don't have time for that. They probably wish they did, but they don't. And this is the beauty of this model of engaging volunteers in this amazing, noble, old American tradition of welcoming persecuted people from all over the world. So we have been scrambling, but we have also been placing families with community groups. Of the 407 individual Afghans that we have resettled since October 1, 127, roughly 30% of them, have been placed with community groups all over the state of Connecticut. And we'll be placing probably another 127 over the next 2 or 3 months. So thank you for giving me a chance to talk about our work. And again, it's an honor to be among all of you amazing people. Khalil, let's set a time and chat about plumbing.
Thank you so much, Chris. Iris really has done a phenomenal job of building a community that's very supportive of refugees. I think it's been remarkable. Just the interest of time, I mean, I have a bunch of questions, but I like to see if there are questions in the chat box, and I see a number of questions. Feel free to add more questions if you like. We may stay a little bit over our time. Those of you who have a opportunity to stay beyond 7:30, feel free to stay. Maybe you can stay another 10 or 15 minutes. I see a question from Lulu Wong for Richard. Richard, when you say everyone experiences some sort of tragedy in their lifetime, do you distinguish life circumstances such as death versus tragic circumstances such as murder?
Well, you know, it's very important to not compare different situations of mass violence on some kind of a scale, you know. And what I was trying to say is that developing a solidarity, a listening solidarity, means one has to be also sensitive to one's own vulnerability, you know, and one's own family history of tragedy, you know, and because the whole key is empathy here, you know, being empathic. And we've had patients, we've seen over 10,000 patients in the greater Boston area, and we've had patients come in with stories so unbelievably depressing, overwhelming, and traumatizing to the listener that we've had to stop the interview after 10 minutes. It was just too much. And we would say, please, you know, we really want to hear your story, but let's do it a lot over a long period of time. You know, it was just devastating to hear the story. Now, the problem is that we collect, can you imagine listening for 40 years to mass violence, torture, rape, murder, etc. For you know, we collect in our body, in our mind, these stories. The listener collects these stories, and we have to have ways of trying to continue good listening. You know, in other words, listening is all about empathy, but also, to be frank about it, my patients usually say to me, Dr. Malika, I don't tell you the whole story because you can't handle it. You couldn't handle it. And it's true. So they spare me, and they'll say, well, let me tell you this terrible atrocity that happened, and I'll tell you some more next week. Because, you know, we've listened to our patients every week. I have patients I've been with me 35 years. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think we have to learn how to listen empathically to other people's stories. And partly it's by getting in touch with the tragedies that have happened in our own lives, you know.
Thank you for that. Joellen, can we stay on for a little bit longer?
Yes, it's Rachel. We can, I think we still have this open. This is fine if we want to do this. And when you want to wrap up here, we can go to the meeting room later.
Sounds good. I see two other questions. One is from Joe Williams.
I think Khalil had his hand raised.
Oh, go ahead. Khalil, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually wanted to make a few comments. One of them was regarding Professor Malika's assessment. I remember finding myself sitting in my room in Greece, waking up probably at 5 in the morning, sobbing like a baby because of what I heard the previous day. Some of those stories are not just traumatizing for the storyteller, but also for the listener. And I can't agree more with that patients who tell you could not handle the whole story because it is so juicy and so detailed and so violent that and as an interpreter, I had to listen to every single word and I could not miss anything. And then absorbing that story and then repeating that in a different language, I had to go through that twice, not just once. And some of those details I could relate myself because I have lived some of those details, not probably all of it, all the traumatic experiences, but some of it. I would find myself sitting on my bed at 5 o'clock in the morning, crying because it was too much. And it did not take more than 6 months. I had to resign because otherwise I would have gone insane. And I had to explain myself that I cannot handle. I asked few of colleagues who stayed there for a long period of time, and I asked them how they did that, how they could deal with this. Their method wouldn't work for me and it wouldn't be the ideal method. So I had to resign. And going back to Chris, and I think Chris, we have few more things in common, not just the plumbing experience. I also work with the Combined Arms. What we do is basically we are trying to fill the gaps that is created or whoever that is falling through the crack. As you might know, Houston resettled almost 6,000 or actually over 6,000 people, mostly parolees, some special immigrant visa recipients. And we have 5 major agencies that are scrambling, just like you said, trying to meet the demand here in Houston. And our group, we're also heavily relying upon the volunteers. Our volunteers are mostly veterans or somehow military connected individuals. So we heavily rely on their support. So I just wanted to give you a little brief. Since the 2019, where our group started, SIV and Allies group started, we managed to serve over 1,000 individuals in a variety of different ways. Again, we're not a resettlement agency, but we're just trying to support anyone who is falling through the crack. And we provide them with not just picking them up from the airport, not just visiting them at home and listening to their story, but also providing them with equipment such as laptops, iPads. We did emergency food and water distributions. Last year, we had a huge winter storm. We had to step up and provide water because water was freezing. This year, we had to provide food and we do system navigation. Some people don't really know how to use buses. We help them with, access to transit and transportation system, but also how to navigate system. And we have this amazing platform with a technology where we are connected with over 187 organizations who are supporting veterans. However, out of that 187, around 35 organizations are willing to step up and support SIV and allies. So we are referring those clients who need support through our technology, through our platform, and to the organizations who are providing the services. So we've been ramping up our efforts, and we're working to increase that number of organizations where we can provide a better and more substantial and more lasting support to the Afghan allies.
Thank you very much, Khalil, for sharing those experiences and insights. Richard, there is another question for you from Joseph Williams, who's a public health student doing his MPH thesis on mental health issues of Afghan and other Middle Eastern children. And he's asking about, I don't know if is your study, mostly your work has been focused on adults, or also have you looked at mental health of refugee children, and whether the 5H framework that you brought up, does that apply to children as well?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a great area for study, and I hope that someone will do it, because we've focused mostly on adults and late age adolescents. Yeah, so I think the question also talked about the developmental issues, and I think these we all know that as parents, that humiliation, our colleagues, Afghan colleagues, humiliation can be very damaging to young people, children, and it comes in many ways, right? And we also know that it's horrible when a child sees their parents humiliated. It's a terrible thing. It's heartbreaking, and can be. So I think the young researchers have to really explore this in depth, because we did not. Yeah.
Thank you for that. There's a question. It says, is anyone part of advocacy to get the Afghan Adjustment Act passed? Is anyone aware of the Afghan Adjustment Act? I don't know if Khalil or...
Yeah, and unfortunately, the Afghan Adjustment Act is not yet introduced to the floor. I have been following on that, because it's a very major piece of legislation, and it will impact lives of all those 75,000 people who were resettled. Basically, that will provide them an automatic adjustment of status, which will lead to legal residency, which otherwise will create chaos if not introduced and if not passed. However, up until now, it is not. And and the reason I say that is because I've been reaching out to my congressman, my district representative's office, which is a very vocal advocate of Afghan allies. She helped a lot in the past with not just Combined Arms, but also with other members of the community. And unfortunately, it hasn't been introduced yet, and I'm not sure why, but I've been trying to get information and updates. No one really knows what's going to happen, but I hope to see that is going to be introduced and it's going to be passed. There's a lot of support across the board to that piece of legislation, not just from non-profit or non-governmental organizations, but also from faith groups and other community leaders, members of Congress who also voiced their support to the legislation. But I still don't know why it hasn't been introduced.
Thank you, Khalil. Shabana and Hasna, there's been different kinds of conversation going on. Are there any thoughts or any that you want to bring up?
I know there is a question directed to Husna, so I'll let her take that. But one of the questions for me was from Richard that I answered. It's a question about our students' ability to connect with their families and whether they would eventually, become refugees rather than return to Afghanistan. And basically, so I did answer that, and you can take a look there. But to elaborate on that, fortunately, all of our students are able to connect with their families, and that's obviously quite central to their well-being and their ability to focus on their studies. They're able to both do voice chat and video chat with their families, the majority of them. But we also, the hope is that a lot of our students eventually, when the time is right for them, be able to go back to Afghanistan. We've been able to pursue some opportunities that, given the platform and given the students' families' safety, and out of concern for their safety and privacy, I can't really speak to. But my hope is that a lot of these Afghans that we work with will eventually end up back in Afghanistan when the time is right. And that in a way, this education and preparation is one for a return to Afghanistan. In early 2000s, when the first Taliban regime fell, there was a great group of Afghans who were refugees in places like Pakistan and Iran who returned to Afghanistan. And a lot of those Afghans were quite influential in both private and public sectors, especially the first group of Afghan women who were both working in these sectors and were advocates and emerged as some of the strongest civil society leaders. And my hope is that that continues, that many of these Afghans, especially those who recently found themselves displaced from Afghanistan or feel like they're in exile, that one day will have the opportunity to return to Afghanistan and contribute to the nation building that is desperately needed in the country.
Thank you, Shabana. I don't see the question of Hasna. Are you able to see the question for you, Hasna?
Yes, I do. Thank you so much. I don't see the name, but whoever asked the question and say kind words, thank you. I don't think I did much, but one thing that we don't have the opportunity in Afghanistan. Whenever we came here, and the Afghan people, when they're coming here, they are trying their best to use this opportunity to the full. So we are just trying our best. That's all. And I lived and I went through all these that with the organization I am working now. I have lived experience, and that's inspiring me to help those who came with nothing and don't have any relatives here like me, and to support them and help them. They don't need all life, like their whole life support, just a little bit encouragement, and to give them, as Dr. Richard said, just listen to them. That would be a big help, to listen to them and see where they come from and what they went through. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasna. I want to be respectful of people's time. I know it's we are 15 minutes over the time period that we had set aside. Rachel, are there any last minute questions that you see that we should address?
I don't think so. We'll definitely have all the questions recorded. So if people felt like you didn't get your questions answered, we'll put you in touch or get them over to the panelists. I think Shabana has her hand raised, so I'll let you call on her.
Sure. Shabana, go ahead.
I have to mention this, though I'm not an alumni of Yale, but the person I co-founded SOLA with was a Yale alumni, and I wanted to make sure that I mentioned that I've been thinking especially a lot about him as we were having this conversation.
Thank you for telling us that. I really want to thank the unbelievable panelists. It's been an absolute pleasure for me to be a moderator for this panel. And I want to thank all the participants who joined us. I know it's a bit late in the evening. Hope you all have a restful evening, and hope we can continue with this conversation. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All for joining.
Thank you, everyone. If for those who wanted,
Thank you.
the audience members, if you guys all want to chat with each other, I just put it in the Zoom link. When we get out of here, I'm going to go turn that on. No obligation, but I know we're trying to replicate some of the things we don't get when we're not in person. So if you want to come join it, we'll do it for maybe 15 minutes. Otherwise, thank you very much to our panelists, and Joelle, and thank you and your team for pulling this whole thing together. So have a great evening. And for those who want to join us, we'll see you in the chat room for a bit.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you very much.
Bye.